Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Fire Ecology of Oregon webinar series. I'm John Punchess. I'm the Extension Forester up in northeastern Oregon, joined tonight by Carrie Berger, one of our Extension Fire colleagues, and Andrew Merschel, one of our great researchers in this area of fire ecology and fire regimes. And joined tonight by Micah Schmidt, who's going to be our speaker. He's our regional fire specialist for northeastern Oregon with the OSU Extension Fire Program. Really glad to have Micah as part of the big extension team and to have him speaking here tonight. He's going to cover some cool stuff for you. Just a reminder for how these webinars work. We are recording. We'll post a recording of this webinar probably tomorrow to our website. The website link is in each of the reminder emails that you get down towards the bottom. And so if you want to get to that site, you can find the recording of this once it gets posted. And Micah has already posted a number of relevant research papers, articles on there under the resources tab. So if you're interested in having some follow-up information, there's lots of additional stuff there. Many of you probably joined a couple weeks ago when I presented, and there were a number of questions that were asked that I promised to follow up on. I've also posted those on the course website. For those of you that need to get continuing education credits, remember that we have pre-approved credits for Society of American Foresters. We also have pre-approved credits for Associated Oregon Loggers with their Pro Logger program. And if you are a certified burn manager in Oregon and need these credits, Oregon Department of Forestry has already pre-approved this series for credits. The details for all of those are on the introductory page of the website. So I would refer you there. There's a little bit different process for each of those. And information typically goes to our partner, Jacob Putney. Reminder that we like to have you put your questions specifically from Micah in Q&A. Keep them specific to this webinar, this very specific webinar, and try to track along with that. So I see that there's already some questions in, and we'll do our best to try to get to those. And I suspect that Mike is probably going to cover a number of those. If you have other more kind of general comments or questions about the bigger series or other things that are happening or want to exchange, observations or things like that, go ahead and drop those in chat. The chat is shared, but please just be nice about it, right? So let's all be kind to each other and offer helpful information here. So with that, I think I'm gonna just go ahead and turn this right over to Micah. And thank you again for being willing to share your expertise with us.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, I'm here in the town of LeGrand, like John said, regional fire specialist for the area out here. And so, yeah, today going to talk a little bit about fire regimes and what those look like, how we reconstruct them, and just kind of go into some things I like to think about when thinking about fire regimes. And yeah, I worked with Andrew, who's on the call here today, and James Johnson for several years at OSU, kind of reconstructing historical fire regimes. So that's what stimulated a lot of that interest for me. So like John said, I put some educational resources up on the website. There are a lot of scientific articles. There's not a whole lot of non-publication type things to look at, but happy to link up more after the webinar if people want to chat more about this topic. So just want to kind of go over what I'm going to be covering today. So first want to go into just fire regimes. What are they? How do we characterize them? And what are the kind of things we use to describe those fire regimes? Then I want to jump into dendrochronology, which basically using tree rings to study things over time. And then I kind of want to get in the nitty gritty because most of the work I did on these fire regime stuff was with tree ring research. So I want to get into how do we collect that data, how do we do all this analysis and data collection, and then actually turn that into findings and communicating to the public, to policymakers, land managers, landowners, all the people who are affected by this stuff. And then lastly, I just want to touch on the management implications because, all the science we all do, it's only, meaningful if it ends up reaching the ground in some way. So just want to touch on that at the end. So let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm talking about fire regimes. So a lot of you have probably seen something like this before. So it's just saying that for a fire to happen, for a flame, you need oxygen, heat, and fuel, and that happens over short time periods and short spatial locations. Topography, weather, and fuel influence wildfire behavior. And then these fire regimes that I'm going to talk about are basically determined by the long-term climate patterns, patterns of ignitions across the landscape and the vegetation across that landscape. And these are over decades and large spatial areas. And yeah, decades kind of understatement because we study fire regimes over hundreds of years, if not thousands, in some of these ecosystems. So if we're going to build out this concept of fire regimes, and we acknowledge that climate, ignitions, and vegetation are generally the drivers of long-term fire regimes, we want to understand how we characterize those fire regimes. So just want to note up here, I put a little lightning bolt and a match, acknowledging that this ignitions piece of it was both a factor of lightning on the landscape, which some areas experience more than others, as well as fire started by humans. In our areas of the Pacific Northwest, this would have been Native Americans starting fires for a whole variety of reasons to accomplish their management objectives and to hold with their cultural values and all that kind of stuff. So with that said, let's talk about the first and most common way that fire regimes are characterized. So this is a frequency. So you've probably heard people talk about frequent fire regimes versus infrequent fire regimes. Probably heard some of those terms to describe those. I'm going to kind of talk about two of these today. Number one, the fire return interval, and number two, the fire rotation. So let's jump into this a little bit. So this map shows here just kind of modeled fire regimes from a unpublished research study here, and just showing frequency varies over space across the U.S. Really variable in our neck of the woods up here in the Pacific Northwest and the Western U.S. in general. And so the fire return interval is just the average time between fires on a given site. So if you have fire, in one place 1 year and then fire 10 years later, that's the start of a 10-year fire return interval. And there's all sorts of groupings of these fire frequency groups. As humans, we like to group things together so we can understand them a little better. And one way I like to group them and think about them is like this. So, fires happen every 0 to 15 years. That's very frequent. 15 to 35 years, frequent, not quite as. Less frequent when you get to 35 to 80 years. And then you get into infrequent fire regimes, over 80 years where vegetation went a long time without fire and developed, a lot of the structure and composition with the absence of fire there. So like I said, this is just one way to characterize them. I just use this for an example. You'll see all kinds of different things with this, but just one way I like to think about them. Then one term that is also used in some research, it's a pretty confusing one and isn't used as much in the Western US, but it's something you'll probably read if you're kind of reading about fire regimes. So I want to kind of see if I can describe it because I always had a hard time understanding this one. So fire rotation is basically the time it takes for an equivalent amount of area to the size of the study area to burn. And I made this little graphic to kind of demonstrate this. So if you have a 100-acre study area in this box, and this could be a property, a sub-watershed, an area of interest, but basically that area that you're studying. And in the first year of whatever your study period is, there's a 25-acre fire here. The second year, you got a 25-acre fire down here. So you got 50 acres there. The third year, you have a little 10-acre fire. And the fourth year, you have a 30-acre fire down here and a 10-acre fire. So if you add all those up, you get to the 100 acres, and that's equivalent to the size of the study area. So this is a very simplified example, but in this case, the fire rotation would be 4 years because it took 4 years to burn an equivalent of that 100-acre study area, even though some of these areas burn more than once. So this 25 acres down here burned twice, same with this 10 acres here. So I hope that helps. I wouldn't spend too much energy trying to understand that one, because like I said, it's not quite as useful when we're characterizing fire regimes, but just want to get that on your radar because it's something you might run into. So another common way to describe fire regimes is by the severity. Probably heard of low and high severity fires, maybe hearing about moderate or mixed severity fires. Pretty important thing when we're thinking about fire behavior and impacts on the landscape. So severity is usually described as the impacts that fire has on either soils or vegetation. So when we look at this, and I'm not going to go into this in too much depth because some of our later presenters are going to cover this as well. But so fire severity is basically that measure of the impact that the given fire has on an environment. We have to, again, make that something that we can understand. So that's why we look at the vegetation or the soils. So fire severity is really often measured by the vegetation mortality because it's easy to see, it's easy to measure. And so we usually use the vegetation that's the largest in stature. So in forests, we're looking at trees. In rangelands, we're generally looking at grass and shrubs and such. So it's whatever that like large stature vegetation is that's kind of dominating a site. And so high severity fire, like in this case, kills most of all the trees in the stand. But in a low severity fire, like in this case, most of the trees survive and keep growing. These are actually taken on the same property that burned this year. So again, shows you the diversity of fire effects. And then the other way is the soil. So Ariel Cowan, my counterpart in Central Oregon, is going to go into much more depth when she gives her presentation after mine. But basically soils, or fire basically can cause alterations to the physical and chemical properties of soils, both beneficial and detrimental. So we're all often worried about really high severity fire because it causes major changes to the soils, sometimes leading to hydrophobicity, which is like where water can't penetrate, ends up flowing in runoff, doesn't get absorbed into the soil. Or it can just put soils in a state that they just don't function the same as they did before fire. And soil burn severity can be harder to measure, especially when you're just looking at a site on the ground there. So there's some useful tools like this one at the bottom here. Chad Boyd, who's a researcher at the Eastern Oregon Agriculture Research Station, developed this really neat tool to kind of combine vegetation and soil burn severity. So he found that the color of the topsoil following a fire was highly correlated to the amount of bunch grass mortality. And when I say mortality, that's not just the grass is getting burned on top. It's actually the root structures being killed to where that plant's not going to, sprout up again the next year. And so he found that these gray soils were correlated with high mortality, black soils less so, and the brown soils had the lowest mortality. So just wanted to throw it out there because I really like these types of tools that they're super useful for landowners and land managers because you can actually go out on your property or in someone else's property, look at the soils and get some information right there instead of, looking over a large landscape. So I just want to show this picture because it really demonstrates severity really well. This is from the Falls Fire in Southeast Oregon this past year. So note this right side of the fire. This was all unmanaged forests, hadn't had anything done. And when the fire transitioned into here, this is all areas that had been thinned and then prescribed underburn a year or two before the fire came through. So want to know here, not only does management really help us in, helping reduce the severity of fires, I want to just note like the variation in severity in this picture. So out here and across this whole landscape, a lot of high severity fire. You can see out in the distance there some green trees, probably lower severity. Out in here, we'd say this is a low severity fire. It doesn't look like too many of those trees are going to go away. And then right here, you're seeing a little bit more of that moderate or mixed severity. You got some crowns lifted up. Some of these trees will probably die in the ensuing year. But when you look over this whole landscape, almost every single forest fire is mixed severity in nature at the landscape level because they almost all have some kind of mix of, high, low, and mixed severity fire. And it's important to think of severity not only, directly after fire like this, but, given especially in ponderosa pine, that there's a lot of interactions between stress trees from fires and bark beetles and other insects. You really want to monitor this and, at least 1 to 3 years after the fire, if not longer, because you're almost surely going to see some more trees getting attacked by insects as they're weakened. And I kind of attribute that to fire severity because it's something that may not have happened, if the fire didn't come through. So I think it's really important not to look at the impacts directly after a fire, but in the years following. And we're getting better and better at that as we move forward, in our natural resources world. So we covered severity now. So let's jump into another piece, which is the extent. And by extent, I'm basically meaning size, basically how large of an area fires burn. And two really helpful ways to look at this are we can look at the area burned in individual fires and the area burned annually. So for current fire regimes and what we're looking at, what's happened now, we have, really so many useful tools to actually map out fires. So I just put on some big fire perimeters on here. These are from the 2020 in the dark red and the big fire year in Western Oregon. 2024 was our big fire season in Eastern Oregon. And you can see we can easily summarize how much area these burned, put that into averages for individual fires, or expand that to, annual averages. But when we're trying to, characterize that for, how much area fires burned before we had all these mapping tools available, before, your American settlement in the area, it gets really challenging because how do you reconstruct a fire perimeter, if you don't have it mapped? That's where, some tree ring science can come in and help. But I just want to mention that this extent is really easy to look at these days, but really hard when you try to go further back in time. So there's 3 of the main characteristics. Let's jump into the 4th one. So the seasonality. So basically just talking about if fires burned in the, spring, fall, winter, summer, what time of year they burned. And seasonality is really important because number one, we have a lot of plants and animal species that have adapted with, some sort of fire regime in whatever landscape they lived in, for thousands of years or even longer before, we humans came and started doing stuff around here. So seasonality is really important because some plants, thrive with fire happening, in the spring. Some don't like to see it till the fall. And so if we can kind of help reconstruct when fires burn, can help us to understand, that natural variation of how, fires interacted with evolutionary plant and animal traits. Yeah, that makes sense. But this map basically shows the current peak regional fire seasons currently across the U.S. So in the PNW, our peak season is generally June to October. No surprise there. That's when we see most of our fires. And this lines up pretty well with what we observe in historical fire regimes across the region as well. So I think it's probably safe to say that, through a lot of our tree ring studies and other studies, it shows that most fires burned probably in the summer and fall, in that dormant growing season of the vegetation when things is too hot and dry to grow. Fuels are drying out, easier for fire to spread across the landscape. Those historical fires, nobody would have been suppressing them, of course, so just easiest time for them to burn when all those fuels are dry across large areas. So just want to touch on that, and I'll talk a little bit later about how we reconstruct that. So now that we have kind of built out this idea of a fire regime, just want to remind, this is kind of the way that I look at fire regimes and how it makes sense to me. And I think it covers, a lot of what's in the literature there. There's a lot of different other ways to think about the characteristics of fire regime. I'll touch on a few of those later just to think about moving forward. But it's good reason to, if you're really interested in stuff, like dive through all the literature and all the research on this, because people have a, whole diverse way of talking about fire regimes, what they care about, what's important to them. And so, do what fits your interest. This fit well with me and just something that I felt was a, good way to get it across. So I'm going to pause here for a second and bring up a poll for y'all just to see if you heard what I was saying. So let's see, relaunch poll. Okay, so fire return interval, what is it? You got 4 options there. Is it the average amount of time it takes for fires to burn the equivalent of a study area? Is it the average amount of time between fires at a given site? The impact that fire has on soils or vegetation? Or the number of fires that occur in a given year? And so I'll pause here for a second and let people respond. Lots of answers rolling in. Love to see you all participate in this stuff. Yeah, a lot of answers. This is great. Okay, I'm going to end it there and share. So yep, 77% of you guys got it right there. The average amount of time between fires at a given site. So a good 18% said the average amount of time it takes for fires to burn the equivalent area of a study area. So remember, that's actually the fire rotation. So the fire return interval describes that amount of time between fires at one given site. And then the number of fires that occur in a given year, that's more just, doesn't really have a name for it. That's just more the number of fires that occurred. So thanks for all your participation there. And just want to take a brief stop here and see if, John, do we have any questions in the Q&A for this first section?
There are questions, but I think you're going to get to stuff later on where you're talking about climate change impacts on fire regimes, I'm guessing. So
Okay, I'll touch on that.
Jump into that quite yet.
Yeah, we can wait on those ones then.
Yeah, so I think you can proceed a little bit and we'll come back to these.
Okay, sounds good. So now that we've covered kind of what is a fire regime, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how we reconstruct historical fire regimes. So there's lots of ways to do this, but there's 4 real kind of main methods that I see generally talked about for how to reconstruct fire. And when I'm talking about historical fire regimes, I'm referring to that period prior to Euro-American settlement in the Pacific Northwest and prior to aggressive fire suppression practices. So this is generally, settlement generally occurred sometime in the mid to late 1800s. Aggressive fire suppression policies were put in the early 1900s. So think about that period. You can just generally say 1850 and earlier. So, so that's what I'm talking about when I say historical. So the 4 methods I see that are commonly used for this are historical documents and photos, traditional ecological knowledge, sediment cores, and dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings. So just going to briefly touch on a few of these. So historical documents and photos can be really useful, because early settlers coming in the area often journaled and wrote diaries about wildfires they were seeing, along with many other observations. I'm actually reading a really great book right now that might interest you folks in the Blue Mountains. It's called Powerful Rocky, and it has many diaries from the early settlers that came in the Oregon Trail, and it's really specific to our Blue Mountain region. So it has a lot of really great entries in there and talks a lot about annual grass fires, fires in the hills. They often call them destructive fires, not realizing all the benefits they had. But some of these historical photos can be really useful. So this is taken out in the Eagle Cap Wilderness in the Wallowa Mountains up here in northeastern Oregon. And this photo up here was taken back in 1936, and this is in 2018. So in 1936, you could probably assume that, you know, the vegetation looked pretty similar to what it did when the fire regimes were still intact. And so it can give us some good insights because up here you see a lot of big openings, a lot of diversity in the canopy structures here. And as you move into what we're looking at currently, really dense continuity of fuel. So you can get some kind of, you know, some a little bit of piece of information that help you look at like what kind of fire would result in this landscape. Probably a little bit of that mixed severity fire, you know, killing patches of trees, creating these openings, leaving other patches of trees. So it can kind of give us some clues to that. The photos can be really helpful, but of course we aren't actually seeing how fires burn through there. And then when we go through like historical documents and like those diaries and stuff I was talking about earlier, they're really cool, really interesting to read. But you know, you gotta put into context that, you know, people were trying to describe what they saw with things familiar to them. So two diaries from people back in the, you know, 1890s can really tell two different stories. People only have what knowledge they had at the time, so they can all be a little bit misleading, but they're really great to be combined with other methods to kind of reconstruct the fire regimes. And so traditional ecological knowledge can be greatly useful, you know, when oral histories or other knowledge has been passed down between tribal members and has been maintained. And so it's important to, you know, note with this that, you know, those stories and that knowledge, that's theirs to share, and, you know, ours as, you know, non-Indigenous people to, you know, learn about when they offer that information. So just be respectful of that. But these stories of fire can be super informative because they give us insights on that human aspect that we don't get through, you know, any through a lot of different reconstruction methods, I should say. So these insights can be on, you know, where fires were ignited, why they were ignited, how they burned, what they were trying to do with those fires, what, you know, what kind of people were using fire for what different uses. I show this picture right here because this is like a great huckleberry patch that I go up to every year here. And you know, there's so many oral histories about, you know, burning the huckleberry fields as they would leave the mountains. That would keep the forest open, and, you know, huckleberries love open canopy forest to grow in. And so, you know, there's some ecological outcomes that change based on taking those fires out. But as well as, you know, that cultural importance. It's just something that, let's see how to say this. It's something that was culturally important to them, ecologically important to some of these species like huckleberry, and we're seeing some pretty major changes by removing, you know, that influence. So the last one that I'll cover before tree rings here is sediment cores. So sediment cores are used to reconstruct historical fires going back over very long time periods, you know, thousands and thousands of years. And they're really useful because sediment cores contain charcoal. Charcoal is made by fire, so obviously you need some kind of fire burned if you're seeing charcoal. And so this graphic just shows that as fires would have burned in forests and other systems, airborne fall to charcoal would have been, you know, charcoal would have came up in the air, kind of been deposited, would have come down from the slopes, and deposited in these lakes, which would have basically maintain the sediment, maintain the charcoal in there because they got that water on them. And sorry, not a scientist in this aspect, but basically it maintains like a sediment record where you can look at the layers of sediment, determine when those were formed, and if you see charcoal in those, you can kind of determine the when fires burned, around that landscape. These are generally like the most effective for, reconstructing really large fire events, and they're a fairly coarse method for reconstructing some other aspects of fire regime. But again, it's just this is a way to go back really far back in time, probably farther than any of the other methods, and to see kind of a different picture than some of those other methods give us. But what I really want to dive into today is where I consider most of my expertise in this to be at is into dendrochronology. So basically the study of tree rings. This is the most common method used in research today to reconstruct historical fire regimes, to get those fire return intervals, some of the fire extent, and to actually assign fires to individual years over time. So I'm going to dive into this a little bit today, and just encourage you as you're thinking about this. I took this picture actually out on a wilderness trail. This tree had been cut down off the trail. It's a large tree, and you start counting up these rings, and gosh, pretty sure there might be 1,000 rings on that thing. So hopefully after I guide you through all this, you'll see some of these down logs, stumps, and kind of get a little bit intrigued by what you see on the tree rings. So let's go into a little bit of tree ring 101 just to start it off and get on the same page. So as trees begin to grow in the early spring, when temperatures start warming up enough for them to start growing again, they start to put on early wood. And so as you can see in this graphic, the early wood is this lighter colored wood here. You can see it like right in here. This would be early wood on an actual tree ring sample. starts to form. And then as we start to get into summer, that starts to transition to like a denser layer of cells, starts to get into darker wood, and this is our late wood. So as you can see, this is generally that spring, early summer growth, transition to late summer and fall growth until that tree eventually goes dormant and stops growing for the year and sits through the winter until the next growing season comes. And so the growth pattern of these annual rings are strongly correlated with climate. So, long-term patterns and precipitation, temperature, and other things that influence tree growth, that all the interannual variability, those year-to-year changes we see in weather and climate. And so in drier and hotter years, trees generally grow slower and the rings are smaller. And in wet, mild years, trees usually grow faster and the rings are larger. And so that's really important because that kind of forms the basis of how we actually cross-date wood, which I'm going to get into in a few slides here. And so at the center of the tree, we also have this first year growth. And so at the center of the tree, all the way up the trunk, what's referred to as the pith. And so this is like a soft, spongy-like material that forms that central portion of the tree. And that just basically establishes where the tree started growing in each individual year. And this graphic also shows you, a scar. This says a scar from a forest fire, but it's important to note that many different tree species, most tree species form scars in some kind of way, shape, or form. And these scars can be from fire, they can be from frost damage, from mechanical damage, trees bashing into each other, or anything else that damages the tree and just leaves a little scar in there. So the formation of these scars and when they're related to fire is particularly crucial to the science behind reconstructing historical fires, because we can line these fire years up with the year that they grew and kind of figure out when fires actually happened over time. So I'll go into that a little bit more later here. And so as we're moving through this, just want to think about this. So this is what we're trying to get to when we're looking at tree ring samples. This has the years of each ring actually identified. So this is year 1550, this is year 1600, and every year in between that. When we're doing this, when we're labeling these pieces of wood, we use three dots in a pencil to mark a century. So that's 1600. Each dot's a decade, and each two dots is 50 years. So you can kind of count back 10, 20, 30, 40, or what would be 90, 80, 70, 60, really. And then each ring in between that just makes a shorter span of time to count when you want to go actually assign rings a particular year. So what I want to kind of talk about now is how we actually get to this point where we can assign a year to each individual ring, which again forms that basis for all our work here. So these are some helpful graphics that talk about where cross dating comes in to make sure we're getting accurate representations of which years and in which years rings established. So cross dating is basically when we're able to assign individual rings to the year in which they were formed. So again, we're able to do this because tree rings are so strongly correlated with climate and interannual variability of that. And some of these figures kind of show that concept behind cross dating. So first, with any study, you got to find some samples from living trees where the outer year, so you can kind of count back from there. So this kind of a poor example shows a living tree. That tree is obviously not living. Looks like it was cut down to me. So this is where we actually take tree cores. We don't actually cut the trees down to do this, but take tree cores so the tree can keep growing, but we can get the information we need. So basically, we know this outer year. If I cored it this year, this outer year would be 2025, and then we can start counting back all the way back. This one goes to 1940, 1930 here. And we want to have like really clear tree cores that we can confidently count back there. So once you have enough of these samples of these living tree cores, you can start to look for dead trees or samples where you don't know what the outer year is there. So with those trees that you established earlier, you're starting to build what's called a chronology, which is just a record of tree rings, the years and the size of those rings over time and the patterns of growth. And when you develop that chronology, you start to have like a record to compare other samples against. So like I said, about trees being highly correlated with climate, we can start to take these tree cores and cross sections that we don't know which ring is which. We can line those up with the rings that overlap from these living tree samples. And we can use some statistical models to give us a really, really high sense of confidence that this year is 1910 on this sample, so it's 1910 on this one, and so on. And so this takes measuring a bunch of different rings and kind of looking at the patterns of growth every time, since, like I said, strongly related to climate. So yeah, that'll all be verified by statistical software, and you can just keep going back further and further in time. This one only goes back to the 1800s, but we've been cross-dating samples that go back 700, 800, 900 years, so you can go pretty far back in time with this. Just want to show down here another example of that. You can see these tree rings kind of line up over time on these graphics, and that's what gives us our basis for cross dating. If you're just trying to count from the outer ring back on every sample you got, well, number one, you wouldn't know the outer ring on those dead trees. And number two, if you run into rings, you're like, well, I'm not really sure if that's a real tree ring, if I should count that or not. You start to like get further and further from, which year you're actually looking at. So with that said, I just want to again show you why cross dating is so important and why you can't just count backwards from rings. So this is a tree core, and the outer side of the tree would be over on the left side here. So late woods to the left, and then the early wood. And then this would be the inner side of the tree over on the right side here. So I have these years 1752 to 1750 identified. And so if we start to count backwards, this is what we'd come up with. 52, 51, 50, 1749, 48, so on until you get to 1741. And that's where all the visual rings would be. But if you were to put that in that statistical software that verifies your cross dating, it would give you a flag and say, hey, you're kind of off by one ring somewhere in there. And so this is where cross dating becomes so important, because if you compare this to a bunch of other samples and keep going, then the cross dating would actually look like this. Be 1749, 48, 47, 46, 45, 43, and see how it jumps to 41 here? Well, we actually have a missing ring in 1742. Wouldn't have known that if you didn't have other samples to rely on, but it's likely that in 1741 here, that there was some kind of injury that caused the tree to have a big suppression in growth. Likely a fire. It's a pretty common thing to see with a fire, but could have been, again, mechanical damage or something else. So this is why cross dating is so important, and why we can't just, walk back further and further. We can't just count back further and further on every tree ring sample we have. So I'm going to take another pause there. Looks like we've got some more questions in the Q&A. Yeah, what do you got there for me, John?
We have quite a few questions. So let me just work through. First of all, in order for a fire scar to show up in a tree ring, does that mean the fire had to have been severe enough to penetrate the bark?
Yeah, great question. So no, it didn't have to actually penetrate the bark. So most fire scars are actually caused by the radiant heat. So fire is burning at the base of that tree, and it doesn't necessarily burn the bark and burn through and actually burn onto those tree rings. That heat is just enough to get to a critical threshold where it kills those outer cells in the tree rings, and then the tree is forced to form a scar that it has to then grow over there. So there are definitely examples. You can see it these days in fires where the sap on the side of a tree will light on fire and it will burn through the bark, but more, almost all the time it's that radiant heat, moving through the bark and getting to that critical threshold to kill the cells.
Good, thank you. So how far back in time do you go when you're calculating fire return interval? Is it 100 years, 30 years? Is there any standard to that, or does it depend on where you are?
Yeah, good question. Definitely depends on where you are and what your record of tree rings is like. So if you're in an area that you have a really good record of tree ring and fire scars going back 600 years, and you have a lot of sample depth, a lot of data to look at, you could calculate it over that long period of time. But really got to look at your data, because there's not 600-year-old trees everywhere on the landscape. Some areas you might be looking at over only the course of a couple hundred years. So you have to determine, like, at what span of time do you have a lot of confidence in that data that you're capturing most of the fire scars, and then you calculate the fire return interval for that, and then you can make, in the discussion section of a research paper, you can start to make extrapolations of other things. Say, hey, we saw evidence that this may happen, or that the fire return interval may have been longer or shorter further back, but we don't have the data to support that. So definitely depends on the situation there.
Great. What are the limits to cross dating? Are you selecting the same species, same sample area, same ecoregion?
Yeah, so limits cross dating. So generally, you want to cross date samples from other samples somewhere in the same general vicinity. So trees, say, that are growing in the same forest stand, their tree rings are usually really highly correlated, because they're experiencing that same weather, that same long-term climate. So that pattern of growth be really similar. As you get further and further out, it gets harder to cross date. So you wouldn't want to use a tree ring record from Arizona to cross date a tree from Western Oregon. But with that said, say in the Western Cascades, maybe you could use one down east of Eugene to help cross date something east of Portland, but you can have less confidence with that. So you got to establish some good records and then work out from there, or again, go and core some living trees near where your samples are, so you can have some good confidence that you're doing that correctly. And also, we'll touch on the species thing. Some species are way easier to cross date than others. Douglas fir, pretty dang easy to cross date. Ponderosa pine, pretty dang easy to cross date. Grand fir, other true fir species. Hemlock can be really challenging just because they often grow suppressed in the understory, and there's lots of variability in their tree ring growth. That's, can be hard to, and so not just variability in the tree ring growth, but also the shape that those trees grow. You can get like a lot of distortions in the tree rings. But in theory, if you have a good enough sample size, you got good enough samples, you probably cross date most things in our region, the PNW here.
And Micah, just to be clear, in your sample, could you include multiple species?
Yes, you can, and oftentimes they're correlated, but sometimes not so much. So you're going to have much better success if you're cross-dating hemlock samples based on other hemlock samples. Much better success if you're doing Doug fir based on other Doug fir, but there will be correlation, between those species. It just won't give you that same level of confidence all the time.
Excellent. So the other questions that are, one more. How do you confirm that a ring is missing versus actually being like new data?
Yeah, so that's where it's really important to build that chronology, that record of tree rings from samples that have really clear rings. Like if you look at the screen here, pretty certain that we're not missing a ring in here because there's almost always some evidence, some suppression associated with missing rings. So you try to build that sample or that sample depth over a ton of different tree ring samples. They begin getting more and more correlated, and then you get to a point where it's like, if there's a missing ring, the computer will flag it so fast because you have 200 or 300 other samples that show you there should be a ring there. So this is, again, we often, cross data sample. If we're unsure at all, we'll just put it aside, save it to later till we have better sample depth. So all those hard samples cross data get saved for last, just to make sure that we're really, really confident, because there's a lot of implications, for this kind of research.
Excellent, great. So the other questions that are in the Q&A have to do with how like fire return intervals are changing, fire regimes are changing. Are you gonna like come to that later in your presentation?
So let's save that at the end of the presentation. I'm going to save most of that for the rest of the presentations in this series that'll cover actual, different vegetation types and regions of Oregon, because that really varies across all the different landscapes out here. So I'll touch on that a little bit at the end, but if you're really interested in that, stay tuned for other presentations because, yeah, it's super variable.
Great.
Yep.
Right. Thank you. Forward ahead.
All righty. So now that we've covered the cross-dating piece, we have a little bit of information about that. Let's talk about fire scars, which are, the whole foundation of how we, do all these fire history reconstructions. So I really love this Gary Larson comic for you Gary Larson fans out there. You see this ring here, Jimmy? That's another time when the old fella miraculously survived some big forest fire. And so you can see the scar they're pointing at here. And this is really cool because you talk to old loggers or people whose dads were old loggers or whatever it may have been, and a lot of them did see these fire scars. And there's even a couple researchers back, I think it was in the 70s, were going to old growth clear cuts, looking and saying, we're seeing a bunch of fire scars, kind of interesting to see in these forest types. So people were seeing this stuff. And so I just always think it's interesting when, we talk to people and like, hey, I saw fire scars, years ago when I was doing this thing. And so fire scars are also, sometimes visible in cat faces, like this one here. So cat faces form from repeated fire that essentially maintain an open wound at, the base of the trunk here. So cat, and you usually see this in ponderosa pine because they're associated with frequent fire. The tree doesn't have time to regrow over that, and they're slow growing trees. You can also see these cat faces in trees that have been logged a long time ago. So this is from the Mount Emily Recreation Area out near La Grande. And yeah, this is where we take most of our samples from, these stumps. We don't want to go cutting down old trees to study this stuff, so we use what's already been cut down, and they stay solid for a remarkable amount of time. So with that, I want to just do a little exercise here for you guys to utilize the chat. So looking at this ponderosa pine sample, just want to take just a few seconds here and tell me how many fire scars do you think you see in this picture? So go ahead and go in the chat and let me know what you think. Yeah, one answer coming in. 8, 8, 9, 7, 8, 9, 7. Yep, everybody's really close on there. So that's great. So you're far ahead of me. So we have one little tiny one here, number 2 here, 3 right up 3, or sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I saw a few you wrote 9, and yeah, good call, because I'm pretty dang sure that's a fire scar right now, right there. Kind of a trick one because it's kind of falling off the screen. But yeah, typical ponderosa pine fire scars. There's just like little notches in the wood. This black piece would be the inside of that cat face that I showed you earlier. But to be really confident about this stuff, we want to know, like, how do we know if it's a fire scar, not just mechanical damage or frost damage or something else? So when we look at fire scars, they really vary. This is typical what Doug fir fire scars tend to look like, wounds that heal over, and you can see there's a wound here, but the tree healed over, and there's no cat face left over there. This is a portion where fire was pretty frequent through there, but still the tree kept, growing over pretty fast. Ponderosa pine doesn't grow that fast, and it usually experiences more frequent fire. So you see, those wounds not healing over. You see kind of openings here. So there's a few things to indicate what's actually a fire scar and what's some kind of other damage. So the first big indicator is replication. So we try to replicate fire scars across a bunch of different samples in any given site. So if you go in an area and you take cross sections from 20 stumps or something, and 10 or 15 of those have a fire scar in 1745 or a scar in 1745, pretty likely that's a fire because it burned through there, left evidence in all the trees. Whereas mechanical damage, frost damage, other stuff like that, probably not going to impact all the trees the same way there. So that replication is really, really important for this science. Another thing or another good indicator is that fire scars generally form right along one annual ring. Given that like I said, that's that radiant heat that usually causes those cells along the rings to die. So as you see here, it's a little chance. This one's better right here. If you see along here, that ring is about the same size and it sits on the same position of that ring all the way across. If this was mechanical damage where another tree fell into it and broke off some of the bark, you'd probably see the scar crossing over ring boundaries, and so you couldn't tell what year that scar actually formed. With fire scars, they almost always sit really neatly along these ring boundaries and along the same portion of the ring. So this one looks like it's forming right along the late wood boundary, maybe in the dormant season. Same with this one, but if it was in the early wood, you'd see it forming along the early wood across the whole range of the scar there. So the other indicator is another obvious one is charcoal, the presence of charcoal in the scars. So oftentimes you can see some blackened material in here. So if you see charcoal inside there, probably a pretty dang good chance fire caused it because nothing else creates charcoal. So that's just another thing, just that gives you some pretty good certainty that it is a fire scar. And again, look at how these fire scars sit right along the ring boundary. They don't jump over different rings most of the time. And right here, and this is also how we get to that seasonality of fires. So the growing season does vary over time. So the position of the fire scar on the ring doesn't tell us exactly what month or when the fire burned, but it tells us about what time of year. So if it formed on the early wood, like this one looks like it may have formed in kind of that late early wood, that was probably somewhere in like a late spring, early summer fire. If it formed the dormant period, that's probably a fire, after the tree stopped growing and probably late in the heat of the summer, because it's not likely that as many fires burned in the winter, which is also part of that dormant fire, or sorry, that dormant season. So there is a lot of uncertainty about this, and but we can generally say, this fire burned early in the growing season, spring, early summer, late in the growing season, and take some information back from that. But you got to treat it with some caution, of course. And so even when fire scars aren't present, there can be dramatic changes in growth that can give us some evidence of fire. So note here, this what we call a suppression event. So out here is the outside of the tree, out here would be the inside, and this is a portion of it. So you have this big ring right here, and then suddenly the growth drops off tremendously. This ring is, maybe 20% of the size of this one here. So that is, it's almost always some kind of evidence that the tree experienced something that really reduced its growth. That is often related to a fire because fires, they're basically injuring the tree for a period of time. And even if that growth takes on later, you often see suppressions associated after fire events. So maybe a fire burned in this year and then the tree started growing slowly. Maybe this was an injury or an insect attack as well. So just from this, we can't draw any conclusions on exactly what it was. But if say this is the year 1750 and you have another sample with a 1750 fire scar, this suppression gives you evidence that, yeah, it's probably that 1750 fire that caused that suppression the next year following there. So they provide some more evidence that, the fire occurred and impacted the growth. But you don't want to, you kind of want to take that for a grain of salt until you actually get into the scars. And so there's a lot of questions like, how do we know if this is actually, accurate? How do we know that a fire that we reconstruct from 300 years ago actually occurred on the year that we think it did? Well, this was a study done by Ferris et al. In 2010. Encourage you to look into it. It's over in Arizona. And in this area where throughout the 1900s, there was a careful record of fires kept. They actually have perimeters of fires that they mapped out I can't remember, this might have been a national park or something, but definitely an area of interest. And so what these researchers did, they went back, took samples from stumps, identified the fire scars using traditional, cross-dating methods, all the stuff I've talked about. And then they said, okay, do these fires line up with those perimeters, since we actually do have a mapped fire history? Turns out they were they lined up very well. So this sample in particular, so 1943 fire scar, and it's within a 1943 fire perimeter. 1950 fire scar, again, within a fire perimeter, and so on. So this was a really important study that kind of gave more credence to the work, the work that tree ring researchers were doing at this time, to show that at least in Ponderosa pine, did a really good job of fire years lining up with actual fires. Basically, it was just like a quality check on the work we were doing. This kind of study hasn't been done on many other species, or any other species, I don't think. And so there's a little bit more uncertainty when you get into cross-dating fire scars and other species, but still, we have a lot of confidence in that, because even anecdotally, a guy I used to work for had gone to stumps in areas where he knew there was a fire years ago, and then they logged it and then saw that fire scar on that stump, so there's just a lot of information to validate this work that's happening in the fire history world. So we're going to stop for another poll here and give you guys another chance to interact. So in this poll, I want to know, what are the 3 indicators that a scar in a wood sample was caused by fire? So I'll just let you read through those 4 there, take your time, and once we get some answers rolling in, we'll present the results. Yep, a lot of good answers pouring in. Great, I'm loving all the participation. Okay, I'm gonna shut it down there for everybody that's answered and share the results. So yeah, 95% you got it right. So presence of charcoal, the scar is located along one ring and it's replicated on multiple samples. So those are 3 big indicators I would look at. This one up here, that 3% answer, yeah, scar is located along one ring, that's right. So on multiple locations on the same sample, well, that can definitely happen, but that doesn't indicate that it's totally a fire scar. And then the wood is rotted, which the level of rot doesn't actually indicate anything. And then again here, yeah, pretty good chance it was ponderosa pine as a fire scar, but not one of the indicators we'd actually use. So thanks for interacting there. And yeah, glad it's making its way to you guys. So let's see, no more questions in the Q&A so far, John? Is that what I'm seeing?
So, again, the questions that are in here so far have to do with climate change and how fire suppression is affecting fire regimes.
Okay, sounds good. That's it. We'll just hold those for a little bit longer here.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So let's get into, now we know about cross dating, identifying fire scars. Let's get into a little bit of like the actual nuts and bolts of doing a fire history study, because not many people get to have an inside look and like what's going on here. So first start off with the data collection. How do we design, a study to actually collect meaningful data for what we're trying to do? So that starts with the sampling design. So every good research study will identify a sampling design that's driven by what information they're hoping to gain from that study. This is a good example of a common sampling design used for fire history reconstruction. This was a 2023 study in the Middle Fork Willamette drainage east of Eugene that my old boss James led, that we recently co-authored a paper in 2023 on together with some others. And this shows you that like a typical grid of fire history. So the reason why we do this is we want to get information about fire histories over a range of vegetation types on a landscape, because historically a lot of fire history studies were just like somebody thought an area was interesting, there was ponderosa pine there, they knew there were fire scars, and they went in and studied the fire history. Now that we want to understand fire across a lot of different vegetation types, we have to expand what we're doing and look at actually capturing the range of variability. So what James did here in the Middle Fork Willamette was set up a grid of 16 plots as shown on this right side of the figure. And these plots were located on national forest land and covered a range of vegetation from low elevation white oak and ponderosa pine woodlands, all the way up to high elevation subalpine forest. So if you were to look at this, we'd have some low elevation sites down along the river here. And then once you're getting up into here, you're getting into really cold sites with a lot of snowpack and, subalpine fir, mountain hemlock, some higher elevation species. And so at each site, you can kind of see the little bit of yellow in these sites. That was the perimeter of the area we actually collected samples. And each one of these little red triangles was an individual sample we collected. So site 10 is expressed here, and it shows you that we just collect a whole bunch of samples around the site to really make sure we're capturing as many fire scars as we possibly can over an area that would have probably experienced, like everywhere within this in this little black, shape here, probably would experience, the same fire regime. There's not any major topographic barriers or anything else that probably would have stopped fire. And then, of course, when we're thinking about reasons for the studies, we had those 2020 wildfires. So this is a pretty timely study because it sits in an environment right between a lot of those fires, and it's somewhere we want to know where these large, big fires, actually something that happened historically, or there's something kind of new. So answering some questions there. And then also paired it with a bunch of tree cores that we got from unmanaged forests to kind of help identify the age structure in the forest, or the age structure and the species composition of forests, and be able to relate those to those fire regimes. So we have good data to work off. And so then, we go out to each site and look for stumps of old trees that were logged. And most of these were usually logged somewhere in the 1970s through the 1990s, over on the west side of Oregon there. And, typical large Doug fir forests in the case of a lot of these studies. And, what we basically do, we go out there with big chainsaws, we cut the tops off stumps and find the ones that have solid wood, look for fire scars, look for those pith, those inner rings, so we can age trees, get an understanding of what's happening there. And so basically what it goes from, we cut a sample out here, and like this is a ponderosa pine, cut that thing open, this is what it looked like, pulled these two samples from it, and then this little box here is what we actually use to establish fire scars. So even stumps that, have a lot of breakage and we can only get little chunks out of are really helpful as well. And in Doug fir, I think it was thought for a long time that these mossy covered stumps in wet forests weren't going to have solid wood in them. They probably wouldn't have recorded fire scars anyway because they have big, thick bark. And so people didn't really attempt to do these fire history studies until, just in the last, decade or so. And so I just want to really highlight this. So if you were to walk out and look at this stump, probably wouldn't think there's really good solid wood in there, moss forming all over it. But then you cut it open and you see we have a really good tree ring record, got fire scars, and so we can get a good record from that. Of course, when you go out here, you probably cut 30 or 40 stumps open and maybe take 20 or 25 of them home because some of them do rot, especially those that didn't experience fire, because fire generates kind of a pitch response that helps maintain that wood even longer in the future. But it's pretty amazing, some of these things you wouldn't think would be solid at all. You cut open and it's like it was cut down yesterday. So really interesting thing there. And then just want to have a couple more examples of sampling trees. So this is another one of those big Doug fir stumps. We're cutting out in the rain. This is Sven here, a great sawyer and a great friend too. And then this is a ponderosa pine, which had tons of fire scars on it. And you can see, really had to dissect this thing, cut the top off again, cut a little piece from there, cut a little piece from there. Everything that we can possibly do to get as much of a complete record as we possibly can. And it's really easy with ponderosa pine because this was a visual cat face. I knew there was fire scars on there when I went to cut at it. But this one, Sven had no idea if there were fire scars or not. It had a big mossy mat on it. And so I just had to cut in there and do some, exploratory work. So once we have the samples cut, and this right here shows you a sample that was freshly cut, but obviously it's going to be kind of hard to cross-date anything on there, just not a clear picture of it. So we got to process these samples to make them actually useful to us. So the processing, it took a huge mega step forward, in the last few years. So when I first came to doing this work back in 2020, Andrew and James, the guys I was working with, all they were using for the most part was a belt sander. You take these big, ugly, pitchy pieces and belt sand them from hours and hours. The belt would get all pitchy, be hard to get them nice and flat. And it was just super labor intensive to get them down to something we could actually cross date and that looks nice. But got some funding a few years ago for the OSU lab, and we were able to buy a joiner like this one and a planer. So then we could actually take the samples in there, glue them up if they were falling apart, run them through the joiner and planer, get them flat, and then just take an orbital sander, and it cut the workload down tremendously. So this is kind of like that, that less celebrated part of the fire history stuff, but this is one of the most important parts, keeping all this wood intact, getting something we can actually use in the cross dating. And we often sand these all the way down to 400 grit just to make it easier to distinguish individual rings under a microscope, because some of those things are super tiny and hard to make out. There's the, yep, that's how a joiner works. Basically cuts through there and flattens it out. So once we get it to that really nice polished stage, you kind of have something that looks like this. I've showed this picture a couple times in this study. And so since ring growth kind of varies across the sample because trees don't grow in a perfect circle, so anywhere you look on the sample, you're going to see some kind of variation in the rings. We want to try to find like a path to measure each one of these tree rings into our chronology that gets at the pattern of growth. Because the actual size of the tree rings don't tell us a whole lot on their own because this is a big ring on this sample, but the same year on another ring might be a smaller or bigger ring. And so it's actually the pattern of how these rings get bigger and smaller over time that we're concerned with, because that actually ties and correlates well to that interannual variability in the weather and climate and such. And so when we're doing this, taking it under a microscope, I might take a path like this. It's pretty consistent. I can measure from late wood or the beginning of the early wood boundary to the end of the late wood, and again, over and over again. And after you've done about 30,000 of these rings, you start to drive yourself a little bit crazy running under a microscope. But it's really important to get all these rings in here. It kind of creates that chronology that feeds into our cross dating. And this can be so consistent across samples that if you're working in the same area and you've cross dated a bunch of these, you can actually come look at a sample and visually cross date them without even the computer's help much of the time. And then you can put them in the statistical software and they can verify for you. But you really start to see those patterns, and it's really incredible how distinct they are and how good you can get at actually just identifying what ring is which. And so once everything's measured, we actually put those dots on the rings that I talked about. These are all across there, so you can kind of follow where you're at, but yeah, centuries, decades, and 50-year periods. And we put all this information in a database so we can summarize that information and put together, fire return intervals and other information to help characterize our fire regime. So just an example, we started putting these labels on here a few years ago where you have the sample number. This tree, the inner ring was 1661, the outer ring was 1918. And I had fires in 1918 in the dormant season of the year, 18 or dormant period of the growing season, sorry, 1893 in the early wood. And it kind of characterizes or basically talks about every fire that's on this sample and at what position on the ring boundary they're at there. So we do this for a bunch of samples, and that's how we actually get the data that kind of filters into our summarizing of findings. And so this is really the most important part of all these studies, because most people aren't going to see all that background work that goes into all this. They're only going to see the published paper or the presentation or whatever that you get out to actually describe what's happening with the historical fire regime. So this is a typical example of a figure that represents all the things we've found in a given sample's tree rings. So this dot on the left side here shows when that tree was established. So that's when the tree started growing. So this one was in about 1670 something. Or let's see, pivot tree, no, 1682, that's what that one was. And then the length of this yellow line shows the whole period the whole period captured in those tree rings. So for this sample, the tree established in 1682, and the last ring we were able to collect from the field was in 1902. So you have this record for a couple hundred years. The red triangles in each of these are going to signify where the fires happened. And so in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 fires were found on this one sample. And so it gives us a good idea of starting to understand what that fire return interval is. But of course, one tree can't tell us the full story because individual trees usually don't record every single fire that happened around them for a whole variety of reasons. So, oh, I forgot to put those on there. There's the helpful hints for what I was talking about. But since we can't do it with one tree, we have to take samples within a study site, combine them in a sensible way, and summarize those findings. So this is a good example. It's a history for the site EH19. So this is from the east side of Mount Hood, which is called East Hood Project. And this shows all the trees that we sample at this one site, which is basically a small area that we think fire burned consistently across historically. You can note that this site included about 10 samples. The yellow lines indicate they are ponderosa pine, except for this one. We had one Douglas fir that also captured some fire scars. And you can see that some of these scars were only captured by one tree, and that's where if we want replication, we probably want to go out and get more samples. But in ponderosa pine, the replication is still important, but we've done, there's been so many ponderosa pine fire history studies done now. You can basically look at those scars if you've done enough of this and identify if they're fire or not. But you can still see on here, almost all these fires were replicated across different sites. The more recent fires are generally replicated more because we have fewer trees that, are as old as these ones. This is usually after they form a cat face, and it's easier for that tree to scar with each fire coming through out there. but it kind of gives you the idea of like what's happening in that one study site that you looked at. And so that's helpful, but when we're actually thinking of management implications, we don't want to just look at one site and extrapolate that to a whole landscape. We want to look at a whole range of sites that have, similar conditions, like they have similar species composition, exist at maybe similar elevations, similar climate, that kind of stuff. So we can summarize a bunch of different sites in a grouping. So here's another example from that east side of Mount Hood. These were summarized as warm, dry sites. So these are basically ponderosa pine dominated sites that have that are available to burn, dry out in the summer quite a bit, and experience fire frequently historically. You can see Doug fir was scattered out between these, and maybe even a couple other species, can't tell right off the top of my head. But these are all sites on the east side of Mount Hood within a similar geography, and they have a similar resulting fire history. And so this is where we can actually summarize all these fires, and we can say that in these warm, dry sites, we average an 8 to 13 year average fire return interval prior to 1900. And this kind of gets to that question earlier. So note how our fire history record, we could probably be pretty confident going back about 1700, maybe 1750, and we have a lot of sample depth. Well, we happen to find a couple really old trees here that captured fires way back when. We probably don't have the full fire history for these. This one sample had so many fires, you could probably say that fire return interval had existed, further back than these other samples. We'd probably summarize the findings for this group of trees here because we have good sample depth, good understanding, and a lot of confidence that is what we're seeing. In cool wet sites, it's more difficult, and this is a challenge that's often presented at higher elevations when you get out of ponderosa pine forest, as well as in our western Cascades and west side landscapes where there's a lot of moisture, a lot of no ponderosa pine basically that has good fire scars and longer fire return intervals in general. So for this, you can definitely see just by looking at it, there's much less fire overall, and there's more diversity in the fire regimes. So what you have here, you have this site that we didn't record any fires, going back all the way to 1650s on this sample, all the way through there. We did have kind of a couple sites that were in that cool wet zone, but were still dominated by ponderosa pine, probably because they experienced fire that helped them dominate that site since they're so fire adapted. But you can see this fire return interval was variable over time. It's not like we just had fires here, then all the way over here. We had some more frequent fires in between in some of these sites, and then we did have some longer intervals as well. So it kind of gets to that concept is like, we can't really use just fire return interval saying this is this neat range of years that the fire return interval would have fell into. We got to start talking about patterns on the landscape and patterns over time, because fire regimes in these type of landscapes definitely varied over time and space tremendously. So a good way to describe this is, yeah, fire return interval was variable. Sometimes it was less than 10 years, for periods of time. Say right here, there's some pretty frequent fires in that time. Sometimes it was greater than 100 years, and we showed evidence that we have some stands that are several hundred years old that probably hadn't experienced fire all the way to this point. So as these fire history studies are continue to be completed in more wet forests, really, I know the folks that are working on this primarily really trying to think creatively and think about how do we describe fire regimes outside of just these simple concepts that we've used for dry forests, where fire was more predictable to happen on like a frequent basis, and fire return interval makes more sense. And so I also want to note here that these can kind of help us get a little bit at fire severity as well. So if we go back to the last on the warm, dry sites, and we see that many fires happening, and these trees that recording those fires, kept living through all those, that's a lot of evidence that it was low severity fire. So the fires weren't killing trees. We're not seeing these trees die and then spring back up. But in this example, it shows some evidence that there was probably some high severity fire in this landscape. So over this period of a few decades, we had a lot of regeneration at this site. Same with this one in the early 1600s, same up here. And what that probably indicates is somewhere in this time period, in the decades preceding this, there's probably some kind of stand replacing fire that took out all the trees, opened up the canopy, and then a whole new cohort of trees came in and established. You got to be a little careful with this, because what if this was a site that before all these trees came, maybe it was a non-forested site that was maintained through really frequent burning, and maybe there weren't as many trees here. So that's where you got to just look at other methods. You can look at the soils and what they can tell you about what existed on there historically, because soil is a good indicator of what kind of vegetation can sit on those. But it starts to give us evidence of high severity or low severity and what kind of fire regime happens there. And here's just another example of how we communicate this data, another way to group them. So this is from that study east of Eugene, led by James Johnson there. And what he did here was look at these, what we'd call potential vegetation types. So basically this means this is a Pismi series, which is Pseudotsuga menziesii, which is Doug fir. So those areas that, in the lack of disturbance, Doug fir would be the vegetation that dominated. Doesn't mean that's a vegetation that sits there, but in theory, that's eventually what the forest would move to. So it was really interesting when he grouped them by these, because you can see these Doug fir sites, which were the lowest elevation, kind of the hottest sites. They had a pretty frequent fire return interval, 8 years on average, ranging from 6 to 11. You start to get up into the grand fir, white fir sites, it gets a little bit longer, 25-year interval. The hemlock sites getting a little bit longer. And then you get into these subalpine fir and mountain hemlock sites, which had some really long fire return intervals, over 100 years. And in one of these, sites, we didn't even record any fire. So we're assuming that, we have a record going back 165 years. And so we know there was no fire, in that time, or we at least think from our study. So we don't actually have anything to calculate a median or fire return interval with, because we didn't record fires. So you can kind of see this in the graph here too. Frequent fire at lower elevations, and it's organized less and less fire as you go higher. And you can also look at like which years did a lot of fires happen. So these tall bars here tell you that more sites within that study area recorded the same fire. So that can help you get it extent a little bit, which I'll cover in a minute here. Yep, here we go, actually, annual fire extent. So this is another aspect of the fire regime that's pretty difficult to reconstruct because you got to have like samples across large areas to figure out how big those fires actually were. So this graph just shows the number of sites recording fire in any given year in our study area. So you can see 1773, 1834, 1854 were recorded by 6 or more sites here. And so these sites sit quite a distance away from each other. So that gives us some evidence that either those fires that occurred, like the 1854 fire, was a large fire that burned over a large area, impacted a bunch of different forest stands, or the alternative is it was a bunch of small fires as well that, all these sites may have burned separately. Both those could be true. I tend to think when we see a lot of these sites overlapping that we probably have evidence of some fires that burned over larger landscapes, particularly in dry forest and such. But you got to be a little bit careful with the interpretation. But it kind of just tells you, like, it's pretty often that there is a pretty extensive fire year in this study area. And then many times where we had, maybe a small fire that just burned one site or maybe just burned 2 sites. And so it kind of shows you the variability and, impacts from fire over time. And this does a good job of getting to that same point. So this is some of Andrew's work here in Central Oregon. And Andrew had a bunch of plots in this to look at fire histories. Over here, you can see all the different forest types, range from lodgepole to these different ways to describe, the different forest types that exist there. And this was actually the fire history data that he collected. So all these sites in the red were evidence of large fires, where fires burned across multiple of these sites. So fires burning over large areas, probably frequent intervals. These more blue ones are areas where there are small fires, maybe only burned one site. And these green areas were longer intervals where there wasn't as much interpretation about fire, or wasn't as much evidence of a lot of fires over time. This kind of gets you at a couple things. It gets you at the fire return interval because he has data, for all these plots on how frequently they burned. It also gets you towards the extent of the fire. So if all these plots were burning in similar years, you can probably think, yeah, we're having some more sizable fires, at least in terms of the study area. And it can also, this is like if you're really interested in that fire rotation terminology, you could look and say, okay, we have some polygons that were developed using statistical models and such to like extrapolate from our sites. And we can say, okay, we're seeing these fires across the landscape. They burn this portion of the study area. And we can start to rebuild that time it takes to burn that equivalent amount of area to the study area. So a lot of different ways to communicate this stuff. More and more is coming out as folks continue to do these studies. So with that said, I just want to revisit this fire regime concept that I talked about earlier, and want to have another opportunity for you to tell me what you think in the chat. But just based on what I've said today, which of these characteristics, and you can look at the big circles, or you can look at the small ones, but which of these are the easiest to reconstruct using dendrochronology methods? So I kind of touched on this throughout, and just want to see if you're able to make some of the connection between what we can easily do there. So feel free to go in the chat and tell me what you think with that. So, and we'll move on in a second. Yeah, frequency, fire return interval is coming up. Frequency, fire return interval. Yeah, you guys are hitting the nail on the head. Yeah, so fire return interval is definitely the easiest one. We have, records of exactly when fires burned and how frequent they would have been. Yeah, tons of interactions. Really love all the participation in the chat there. So I'll just go through a little bit of these just to summarize. So fire return interval, I think we can all understand why we can reconstruct that using dendrochronology now. Fire rotation, like I said, just not as useful for our neck of the woods, but just something helpful to understand. Extent, a little bit harder to get at. You got to, take a lot more samples over larger areas and build out that network of fires using a lot of data. So a little bit harder to get at, but you can get some good data there from dendrochronology. Severity, we can definitely have some really great insights about the vegetation and what the severity was in there. Looking at, like, as we see fires, did those trees survive and keep moving forward? Or are we seeing big, regeneration events that seem to be following a high severity fire? We can kind of make some, judgments about soil. Say, okay, if it was high severity in the vegetation, it's probably a little bit, maybe higher severity in the soils, but can't really do too much with confidence there with the dendrochronology. And the seasonality, I saw some people mention that in the chat as well. We definitely can see that from position of scars on the tree rings. But remember, you have to be careful because the formation of those tree rings varies throughout the year. So if you have a dry, hot, winter and spring one year, that early wood on that tree might start forming earlier in the year than it would in a cold year. So yeah, you can get those general seasonality to think about that, but you can't really nail it down exactly. So those are, some of the things that I feel like tree rings can do really well with. And I just want to note there's a lot of other things that, fire scientists look at as far as fire regimes go. So a lot of, wanting to understand the pattern of fires, how they burn across the landscape, when they burn, stuff like that. The relation to climate, so how that, were fires in this area burning in hot, dry summers, or did they burn regardless? They burn in cold years and wet years or hot and dry years. You can kind of also put together, like, if fires are burning in wet years, there's maybe some more evidence that there's human influence as being those sources of ignition. Lightning's going to keep, coming down, but it only turns into a fire if the fuels are ready and available to burn, whereas humans can actually do some stuff to, push fire behavior, even if the conditions aren't totally right for it. And then also, yeah, that relation to the human activity, really want to understand, because humans have been stewarding these lands for thousands of years, before a lot of our ancestors, settled here. And we look at a lot of the ecosystems that resulted from these historical fire regimes and how, our indigenous friends, manage these lands historically. And we really like those outcomes. A lot of us like old growth forest and other things, so we want to know, like, what impact were humans having, what was lightning doing, and just helps us inform what we're doing currently. So a couple more slides here just to talk about what this means for current management and why this is important. So there's a lot of debate about, how much historical fire regimes should be used to inform current management, given that we have a lot of limitations to that. These studies, though, they do provide some type of reference for restoration. So, if I'm talking to a landowner and they want to know, like, hey, I'm in a ponderosa pine setting, I want to have more natural forest. I want to kind of grow old growth forest. Well, it's nice to know that the historical fire regime there was probably frequent and low severity, so they can emulate that either by putting prescribed fire down or by using mechanical or manual thinning treatments to kind of emulate that fire regime. And it's really helpful too, because you can actually, if you're a landowner that has some old growth trees that were cut on your property years ago before you got there, you can look at those old stumps and start to get an idea of, like, what was the density and size of those trees there. And in almost all cases in dry forests, our forests are way more dense than they used to be. We also, really can gain some insights as far as, like, what that determined regime that resulted in those favorable conditions. That kind of goes with that last point. So, like, what disturbance types led to the outcomes we like to see now. We also know that plant and animal species are adapted to certain types of fire regimes, so we can understand that and figure out when is the appropriate time to put fire down and where and that kind of things. We can make our prescribed fire programs more effective for uplifting those ecological outcomes. And but with all this, it gives us so much information to think about. It guides policy, it guides land managers, all that kind of stuff. But it's not the be all end all for guiding management. And that's because there are lots of limitations for using the historical fire regime concept to inform current management. Number one, we have long unburned systems. Some of these areas that burn frequently haven't burned in 100 years now. So if you try to put fire back in there, you're going to have some very different outcomes. So we got to do some things to rebuild the vigor, rebuild the stand structure and composition before we can start looking to putting fire back in there frequently. We've also got invasive species. This is a big issue in Eastern Oregon where we have annual grasses that really thrive with disturbance. So, if you start burning some of the rangelands out here, if you're not careful, you can start transitioning those from maybe bunch grass to more annual grasses. And we're seeing that with wildfires, when those annual grasses get burnt really hard, and when they actually cause root mortality, it's a really good time for annual grasses to come in, and they are more conducive to a different fire regime than what the native plants are. We've also got certain endangered animal and plant species, and we got to think about, if we only have a few populations of these around, we got to be really careful with our use of restoring these historical historical fire regimes and historical species composition and structures, because we got to think about, what are the impacts on these threatened and endangered species that have lived without fire now for a long time. We've also got fragmented landscapes, different ownership boundaries, different management objectives, and all that kind of stuff. A changing climate for sure, which really, really changes our burn windows, changes what we can do, because places that we could have put prescribed fire down 30 years ago at a certain time of year, we can't do that anymore in a lot of cases, because we're still in fire season, because our fire season tends to be getting longer and longer in a lot of cases. And then in the bowl, just the most important one is we have humans, we have infrastructure, and we have different values and objectives. So I love looking at historical forest, information on fire regimes, structure, composition, complexity, all that. And I'm a big advocate for, I want to grow old growth forest. I love old trees, but everybody's got their different values and objectives, what they want to get out of their land. We also need timber resources to support our economies. We want to create jobs in the forest, all these different things. So that's a huge one there, is what we value as humans is what really what really decides what we do for management. So there's many other limitations. So as we're talking here, if you want to put more of those limitations in the chat, then that'd be great. Yeah, somebody brought up smoke management. Another thing, if we're going to use fire to reinstate the historic fire regime, we got to think about those communities that are going to suffer from the smoke. Lots of sensitive people out there that can't deal with that really well. So with that, I think that was my last slide. And so I think we got about 15 minutes here. So if we got some questions in the Q&A, maybe we can address those and see what people are thinking now. So let's see.
Yeah, so lots of questions. So here's a good one. Is it possible to tell the frequency of indigenous fires, or how to tell between like lightning strike fires versus indigenous fires? Do you folks have a way that you can think about that?
Yeah, so nothing we can be sure of. So this is a really important thing to consider when we're doing this research. Now, co-producing knowledge with, indigenous people who often have, like I said, that traditional ecological knowledge to bring into the fray can help kind of clarify some of that, because they can give us insights into things we can't give with tree rings. But just using tree ring reconstruction, we can't say whether a fire was lightning or human caused. We can take some hints, like I said, like if we see fires burning in wet years when you wouldn't expect to see as many fires, that can maybe give us a little bit of information to say, hey, there might have been some human influence here. But there's some work going on in the west side of the state right now, looking at trying to reconstruct like those travel ways and historical areas that Native peoples used a lot, and try to kind of rebuild that a little bit so we can get more inferences into that. But the reality is, it's just impossible to be 100% certain that this fire in 1740 was lightning versus human. So we can only kind of get some hints at that.
Awesome. Do you know of any studies where there have been overlays of the fire histories with climate data to like see if they line up with the Pacific Decadal Oscillation or something, anything like that?
Absolutely, yeah. If you look on the course website, I think a couple of the studies I put on there probably I think go into that a little bit. I know with our we're doing work in the Western Cascades and those wet Doug fir forests. Really want to tie those to climate, of course, because oh yeah, there's Andrew. So yeah. Oh no, he sent to Leslie. Sorry, we're looking at the chat wrong. So basically, many of the studies do try to do that, because we want to understand like what climatic conditions were conducive to fires burning, how the ENSO and Pacific Decadal Oscillations and all that stuff did work. So if you just go into Google Scholar and type historical fire regimes, you'll run into a bunch of studies, or go on our class website for this, and you will see studies that reference that and really try to tie those fire regimes to those climate patterns. So yep.
I just put the keyword for SAF in. It's fire regimes. So before I forget to do that, it's fire regimes. I just dropped that in the chat. Do you know of any studies that have looked at maybe a a correlation between when there were volcanism incidents or activities relative to fire scars to see if there could be any correlation between that particular ignition source.
Good question. I'm not super familiar, but I would, James and Andrew are both on the call today. I'm curious if one of you guys have a good answer for that, because you guys have been doing this a lot longer than I have. Are one of you able to provide some insights there if possible?
Sure. I think that there's definitely climactic signals in tree ring growth records that link to volcanic episodes. And so some volcanic activity has been reconstructed not from scars in trees, but just that pattern and growth over time and how it was affected by a major volcanic event. There's some really cool research in Washington that they're using to reconstruct earthquakes and landslides. So, and there's occasions where earthquakes will cause a landslide and then create a dam, and then a forest will get flooded. And by aging those trees and when they died, or the outer ring on those trees, they can come up with an age of that event. So there's all sorts of different applications for tree rings beyond fire history reconstruction. You can use it to study insects, earthquakes, and things of that nature.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate you
Great,
chiming
thanks.
in there.
Micah, do you want to make a comment about the implications of longer term fire suppression and like how you are detecting that in your tree ring histories, but also like some of the larger implications?
Yeah, so I'm just going to back up the slides here to one of these. So one thing you can see in most of our sites, this is an anomaly because there's some current fires there, but we use tree cores for a lot of this, but we often have samples like here, I guess, kind of come after 1900. You can see that around that period, 1900, fire was mostly shut off. So that tells us, what we already knew. This is when fires start getting suppressed. And we see the evidence by lack of, fire scars in the tree rings. And then, sorry, John, what was the other half of that question?
So longer term implications of fire suppression
Oh, yes.
on fire regimes, fire training. And that's fine if you want to like put off the specifics to future ones, but if you just want to comment on general.
Yep. So in many cases, when we're seeing, especially in forests and areas that burned at frequent intervals before fire suppression, we're seeing some major ecological changes, both tied to fire suppression, but also tied to management practices. The logging of our old growth trees and the planting of species not appropriate for certain sites, all kinds of different stuff there. But these implications, yeah, we have forests that are all over the place outside of our historic range of variability, which is like those conditions, the range of conditions that would have occurred historically. So, for example, in our ponderosa pine forest, it used to be really open, used to have a lot of space, not a lot of underbrush around them because fire came through frequently. We now see really dense groups of trees. And in some cases, we see the species composition changing as well. So maybe it's historically an old growth pine forest. Now we're seeing a young grand fir forest there because fire wasn't there to control that growth. But yeah, there's all kinds of implications for this. I think though we are seeing just major changes in species composition, forest vegetation structure, and then when fires come through now, a lot of times they're more severe than they used to be historically. But again, super variable everywhere, and I'd encourage you to follow up with the rest of the talks in this series.
Yeah, and I think you spoke to this, but just as a reminder that, when you see that fire scar history with all those lines, and then we get to about 1880, 1890, 1900, early 1900s, and all of a sudden there's very few fires showing up in the fire scar history. That certainly shows us that we've got that fire scar record, that we have way fewer fires than what we used to have. So a big change in some of those systems. But as we go through this series and look at different ecosystems, different forest types, we're going to see that the extent to which we've kind of deviated from what we think was historically that range of variation, that's going to depend on where we are, what kind of ecosystem we're in, because there's big variations in that. They haven't all been changed to the same extent.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so that answers, I think that gives us some good stuff around the majority of these things dealing with the implications there for fire return intervals. Do you want to say anything more specifically about the implications of climate change on fire return intervals?
Oh, I mean, we're definitely seeing in a lot of cases, our fire season expanding. We're seeing more severe fires. In some cases, we are seeing more frequent fires, but when you look at like the frequent fire systems of ponderosa pine forest historically, we're still not seeing that frequent of fire in most cases on a given site. But in many cases, we had this big long period from like 1900 through the early 2000s where we didn't see a ton of extensive fire across the landscape. But now, what do we see in the last 5 or 10 years? Seeing fires everywhere. So we're kind of getting towards some thresholds that are really changing some things as far as how fire behaves and how fuels dry out and such. So I anticipate that we'll continue to see, more frequent fire across a lot of areas. But again, it's going to vary. But I think the most important part of that is the severity and the impacts of those fires and the results of those is what's really changing. They're not burning, in many cases, they're not burning in ways that are conducive to growing the kind of structures we want out there in the forest. We have a lot of high severity fire in the landscape, but given that too, even with climate change and all this, we do have good fire during fire season as well. It's always a mosaic of good fire. Well, from our management objectives, good fire versus fire that, doesn't look so good to us. So, yeah, I'll probably save most of that for the specifics though, because we could really get into the weeds with that one.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, and this is building on what you said, but part of what we're definitely seeing is that the nature of fires is changing from what we've been able to sustain during this period of effective fire suppression. And it's certainly resulting in fires that are different than what we would have had before that period of fire suppression. And increasing temperatures, longer fire seasons, invasion of annual species, all of those kinds of things are impacting the way that those fires burn, and in many cases making them larger. So lots of changes within that. There's an interesting question about what are your thoughts about fire regimes that impact urban forests? Have you ever run across any studies that are looking at fire regimes in urban forests?
Ooh, I don't think I really have much insight on that one. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else on the call wants to has any information.
My thought would be that there would be written records of when those fires were, and that's usually not where we're trying to collect that kind of data, but it's interesting thought.
Yeah.
And is there, let's see, do you know of any studies that have gone beyond just looking at fire scars and actually look at like stable isotope analysis or other information that may be captured in those tree rings?
Yeah, so I know like on McDonald Dunforth and other places, there's been people taking tree cores, grinding them up and looking at different carbon isotopes to look at, reconstruct droughts and other, things with the tree's growth. But no, there's just so many different things you can do with tree rings, not just fire history. People also take, old posts from ancient civilizations and cross date those as well to see like when civilizations formed and ended and stuff like that too. So yeah, there's if you're ever interested, I'm sure there's going to be more fire history talks from probably Andrew and James in different arenas. So I'll see if I can dig up any old presentations because I know both of them have given some really interesting ones on all the different ways tree rings can be used for different questions. It's just like this. Where else do you have 100 years records? Going to actual individual years. So there's lots of people trying to figure out all the different ways we can use that. So answer is yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. That's, as near as I can tell, that's all the questions that are in the Q&A. And so appreciate everybody's great questions. Micah, thank you. This was excellent, a great overview, really clear information. Want to remind everybody that our next presentation coming up on Thursday, February 13th, our very own Ariel Cohen is going to be with us to talk about the implications of fire on soils and the biome that exists in the soil. So super excited to hear about that because fires aren't just about what happens above ground. That it's really crucial that we understand that the implications of fire below ground and the ecology there. So very much looking forward to that. And again, the SAF keyword for tonight was fire regimes. And so you would use that to put into the form that you submit to SAF to get your credits. And all the other details for the other entities, for AOL, for CBM are listed there on our website. And even if you are an arborist and want ISA credits, they do their own process. You submit the information, but the information is on our website, so you can get to that. And again, the website link, every time you get a reminder from Zoom on my behalf for these things, that website link for our course website is down near the bottom of that particular message. So thank you again and appreciate you all and hope to see you at the next webinar. Micah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks everybody for coming, and feel free to look me up on the Union County Extension Service website, no matter where you're at. If you want to call me or whatever and talk about this a little more, I always like talking about this stuff. So feel free to reach out if you got more questions.
Night, everybody.